Mebutani, thank you very much for anchoring this particular session. Let me acknowledge Your Excellency Ambassador Omar Abu, Dean of the Diplomatic Corps in South Africa, who is also serving as the Ambassador of Eritrea in South Africa. Let me acknowledge the Excellencies Ambassadors Philho, Wu, Martinon, Ambassador Ayat, Ambassador Akuzanov, who are all members of the core group, and then our very good friend of Africa, Mr. Moti, the head of the Southern Africa Regional Delegation of the ICRC, Your Excellencies, distinguished members. Ladies and gentlemen, we do regard today as a solemn occasion, and we are elated as South Africa that all of you have converged here today on the occasion of the International Humanitarian Day, which seeks to pause and to reflect on our obligations, our responsibility to ensure, ladies and gentlemen, we reduce and minimize the risks that humanitarian workers are exposed to. Increasingly, evidently, we have witnessed the ongoing sacrifice that humanitarian workers are subjected to in their strive, ladies and gentlemen, to protect civilians, to deliver food and medicine, and to safeguard increasingly the dignity of those that are caught up in the crossfire of conflict and disaster. It is therefore today, ladies and gentlemen, a day where we should be reminded of the resilient spirit of humanity, our obligation in as far as international humanitarian solidarity is concerned, and to embody, ladies and gentlemen, our unequivocal commitment to alleviate the suffering in the darkest of times. This tribute, therefore, is particularly poignant given our theme today on international humanitarian law, and that behind every article of every treaty are human beings whose survival depends on our collective courage to uphold the principles of humanity, impartiality, neutrality, and independence. Your Excellencies, let us therefore remember those who have fallen in service and reaffirm our commitment to protect those who continue to do this noble work across the African continent and within the globe. Ladies and gentlemen, today our geopolitical order has witnessed a drastic rise in asymmetrical and hybrid warfare, and what many analysts today describe as a world faced with a protracted polycrisis. It has therefore created a geopolitical environment which is quite complex, uncertain, uncharted, and turbulent. With that, ladies and gentlemen, we have witnessed a rise in right-wing populism augmented by narrow nationalism. It is within this dangerous and tragic global context that international law in general is so essential, and the moral and legal clarity offered by international humanitarian law is more relevant and critical than ever before. South Africa's own steadfast commitment, ladies and gentlemen, to international law, including IHL, is not merely rhetoric. It is deeply embedded in our DNA of our democratic project and within our foreign policy architecture. As a high contracting party to the 1949 Geneva Conventions and their additional protocols of 1977, and through the domestic application of these treaties via the implementation of the Geneva Convention Act 8 of 2012, South Africa has been consistent in championing the centrality of IHL to peace, justice, and international cooperation. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, we should be aware that we have a duty to confront the continued devastating humanitarian crises unfolding across our own continent. Africa today is home to some of the most acute emergencies in the world, each marked by mass displacement, starvation, and untold human suffering. In Sudan, the brutal conflict between the Sudanese armed forces and the rapid support forces has triggered one of the world's fastest growing displacement crises. More than 10 million people have been forced from their homes, both internally and across the borders, creating the largest displacement crisis globally. Entire cities have been reduced to rubble. Humanitarian convoys are obstructed, hospitals are being attacked, and civilians are subjected to starvation, ladies and gentlemen, as a method of warfare. You have witnessed South Sudan. Decades of fragile peace continue to teeter under the weight of communal violence, food insecurity, and climate-induced flooding. Nearly 2/3 of the entire population, it's approximately 7 million people, ladies and gentlemen, continue to face severe food insecurity, whilst millions of children increasingly are at risk of malnutrition. The promise of independence have been overshadowed by diplomatic desperation, with women and children bearing the brunt of recurring violence. In the Democratic Republic of Congo, the DRC, we have witnessed the increased resurgence of armed groups, particularly in the eastern DRC, which equally has resulted in the displacement of millions of Congolese. Sexual violence, ladies and gentlemen, has once again been weaponized on a horrifying scale. Camps for internally displaced people are overcrowded, are under-resourced, and exposed to cholera and measles outbreaks. Despite the presence of large UN peacekeeping mission, we have seen that civilians remain the most vulnerable casualties of protracted insecurity. Excellencies, we cannot overlook the Horn of Africa, where Somalia faces a dire intersection between terrorism, drought, famine, it leaving millions of people dependent on humanitarian aid for sheer survival. It is our submission that these crises, ladies and gentlemen, are not isolated. They are interconnected. They feed regional instability, reverse decades of development, and test our collective response to uphold the principles of international humanitarian law. When civilians are massacred, when aid workers are killed, and when famine is weaponized, we are not only witnessing, ladies and gentlemen, your excellencies, the violations of law, but the violations of the very conscience of human consciousness. It is therefore incumbent upon, in particular, Africa's leaders, specifically African diplomats, and its people, to raise our voices with equal clarity against these tragedies, ladies and gentlemen. It is our submission as South Africa that for African states to continue to remain silent in the face of these ongoing violations is a betrayal to the principles within international humanitarian law. As African states, ladies and gentlemen, our solidarity should not be selective. It must be consistent, it must be premised on principles, and it must be unyielding. It is impossible, ladies and gentlemen, to overstate the catastrophe and the human toll that results when IHL is ignored or systematically violated. The tragic and unacceptable consequences of non-compliance can be seen most starkly today in all of the humanitarian consequences facing the world. We have bared witness, ladies and gentlemen, that in our full flight of our living rooms, an expanded genocide being perpetuated against the people of Gaza. We have seen increased, disproportionate, indiscriminate military action directed to innocent civilians. It has led to massive civilian casualties. It has contributed to the decay, ladies and gentlemen, of water and sanitation systems, coupled with widespread gross violations as encapsulated within the principles of international humanitarian law. The African nation have bad testimony, ladies and gentlemen, to a genocide perpetuated against innocent women and children, where you had an excess of 60,000 people being killed and more than 400,000 people injured, maimed, or displaced because of this genocide. Ladies and gentlemen, in addition, we have seen that voluntary workers, in particular of the Fourth Estate, of media houses, have been targeted, resulting in the death of 275 journalists that has been indiscriminately, deliberately targeted and assassinated by the Israeli state. Ladies and gentlemen, let us not forget the plight of the UNRWA workers in Gaza. More than 400 UNRWA aid workers have been killed. The majority of these 400 has been deliberately assassinated. Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, once again, we must use this occasion to raise our consciousness as human beings, to propel the consciousness of our member states, and to ensure, ladies and gentlemen, that we should never allow selective outrage to determine the universality of international humanitarian law. So once we condemn, ladies and gentlemen, famine, indiscriminate killing in the eastern part of Ukraine, that outrage equally should apply to the indiscriminate, targeted killing of the people in Gaza. It's consistently to principles, it's consistently to conviction. There can be no argument, ladies and gentlemen, that our partners within the more developed economies will continue to champion a narrative that says a state has a right of defense, of self-defense, it being then a basis for the death of more than 60,000 people. The majority are women and children as we speak. It is therefore, ladies and gentlemen, essential to remind today, first and foremost, our African diplomats, our representatives from African states, that exactly 65 years ago, ladies and gentlemen, on the occasion of the 1960 All-African Conference, convened in Leopoldville, today modern-day Kinshasa, Patrice Lumumba argued, ladies and gentlemen, and I open quote, he says, African unity and solidarity are no longer dreams. They must be expressed in decisions, unquote. The call, ladies and gentlemen, of Patrice Lumumba in 1960 is a call that resonates to what the UN have directed us to do today. The United Nations, ladies and gentlemen, have said, in remembrance to the thousands of humanitarian workers killed worldwide, it is essential that today is a call to act for humanity. It is within this context, ladies and gentlemen, that we wish to highlight and equally appreciate an initiative of urgent relevance and long-term significance. This initiative, led by Brazil, France, China, Jordan, Kazakhstan, and South Africa, in partnership with the International Committee of the Red Cross, seeks to galvanize political commitment for the respect for the enforcement and application of international humanitarian law. Never before, ladies and gentlemen, has this initiative been more critical and more relevant. Almost 1 year back, in September 2024, these 6 nations, together with the ICRC, formally launched the global initiative to galvanize political commitments to international humanitarian law at the United Nations General Assembly, UNGA. We have witnessed, ladies and gentlemen, that this initiative have led to a growing urgency for the increased strengthening and respect for IHL amidst the intensified human cost of modern-day armed conflict. One of its key objectives has been to promote a renewed international dialogue and practical engagement on IHL, with the goal of reaffirming a shared global commitment to preserve humanity in times of war. Ladies and gentlemen, once again, South Africa wishes to call upon all member states of Africa, in particular, that are not part of this noble initiative, to join this initiative. You have an opportunity, ladies and gentlemen, as foremost diplomats and representatives of your government and people, to be true to history. Today's event, co-hosted with the ICRC Pretoria Regional Delegation for Southern Africa, is part of our collective commitment to this work. We have brought you here today as head of missions of African diplomatic missions based in Pretoria, with the express and singular aim, ladies and gentlemen, your excellencies, to encourage and to canvass increase African Union state participation, and to recognize the valuable contributions of African states to a more inclusive and representative international conversation on IHL. Ladies and gentlemen, the active involvement of African countries in this particular initiative is not only welcome, but it is essential. We must remind African diplomats that the African continent has borne the brunt of armed conflicts, protracted displacements, and underdevelopment that follows in their wake. We must therefore ensure that Africa should not merely be a recipient of global decisions, but a contributor, a leader, a moral compass for global peace, and more importantly, ladies and gentlemen, for humanitarian integrity. It is my submission that this initiative, ladies and gentlemen, aligns seemingly with the African Union's Agenda 2063 and the second 10-year implementation plan of silencing the guns. We call on your governments to support, to join, and actively promote this global initiative. Ladies and gentlemen, as I conclude, let me reiterate South Africa's unwavering belief that the rule of law must not be the first casualty of war. I repeat, ladies and gentlemen, the rule of law should not be the first casualty of war. The dignity of every human being must be defended with equal fervor. It demands our collective resolve to build a world where international humanitarian law is not merely observed when convenient, but upheld by conviction. I conclude, ladies and gentlemen, once again with a addition taken from the prison letters written by the first post-colonial leader of the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Patrice Lumumba. Whilst in the Tazewell prison, he addressed a letter to Mrs. Lumumba, wherein he stated the following, and I quote, "The day will come when history will speak for itself. But it will not be a history that will be taught in Brussels, in Paris, in Washington. Africa will write its own history, and in both North and South, it will be a history of glory and dignity," unquote. I conclude, ladies and gentlemen, the writing of Africa's history must be expressed through concrete decisions. It is a call today to act for humanity. Asante san, merci beaucoup, thank you very much, Nyabonga.